Each year at the Ethical Society, we organize our programs around a theme. Our theme this year is Exploring the Human Condition. Today's presentation is There is Hope. To echo Brian, there is hope in combating climate change. To help us better understand how scientists are attempting to find solutions to the negative effects of climate change is Dr. Sophia Hayes, a researcher and chemistry professor at Washington University. Dr. Hayes embraces the opportunity to educate students in how to communicate complex science concepts to broad audiences. Please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Sophia Hayes.
And thank you all for welcoming me to this community. Let's also give Jocelyn a round of applause for her act of creation this morning. If okay with you all, I'd prefer to move around a little bit, and I'm not used to not being able to see faces as I give talks. I am here to tell you, yes, about a message of hope, and it's to say that we scientists, we are in this game, in this research enterprise, because we always envision a better world ahead. That's how we devote ourselves to our practice. So I'm going to say, instead of scientists, let's really call ourselves optimists, because again, we use our, let's say, energies, our desire to train others in order to get to that better world. Well, I'm here with you today in part because we all know that we are addressing the world as it is and the one it is becoming. As Brian so eloquently motivated the subject of this talk, we see changes around us that are tremendous in terms of pollution, of course, as he also articulated, in terms of those fires, floods, melting glaciers, all of these effects that are the result of climate change. This is why I'm here today. This group of girls, my daughter is one of them in the photo, they encouraged me back in the first grade to come and tell about my work. They formed a Save the Earth Club when they were only 6 years old, and they asked me to say, they said, Mrs. Hayes, Mama, please go tell people what you're working on. Because I would tell them we do see these climate change effects, but many, many scientists, many engineers are working on this as we speak. To motivate this, I'll just show a few pieces of scientific data that may already be familiar to you now. Some years ago, this wasn't so commonly known. This is a plot of atmospheric CO2 levels. Along this side is the amount of CO2 that's being measured at Mauna Kea on the top of a volcano, very high up. And you see a little red line that blips up and down. Those are seasonal changes. But what you can say is, over time, shown on this bottom axis from 1960 to present, of course, it has been increasing year by year without any declination. In addition, there is growing knowledge of this through newspaper outlets. This is an example from The Guardian. It's a little bit dated, but it used to show up on my iPhone when I would look at their app, their newspaper outlet, and they would report the daily CO2 reading, in addition to what it was, for example, 10 years ago and what it was before the pre-industrial revolution and the burning of fossil fuels. So these are all the motivating pieces that I think now we all know well. And this is good because this is an aspect of public education. There was a time early in my career where some of these things were not accepted as parts of climate change. So we've made advances there. But let me tell you more. Where is the hope in all of this? I'll just have you remember for a moment, for those of you that are of my age, that can recall acid rain. Remember that back in the 1970s, where we had forests that were turning brown and getting destroyed, especially in Europe. There were statues where photos could be taken from 100 years ago and then nearer to the present time, present meaning back in 1980, 1970, where the features had melted because of that acid rain. Well, what we did as a country, as the world, is we came together to create treaties to stop acid rain. And how did we do that, you might ask? Well, it turns out that there was a relatively well-known chemist over in France. His name was Eugene Haudry. Eugene Haudry had a material that he had developed in the 1950s. It was a material that could take in these kinds of pollutants and convert them to something that was not harmful. As you see from this timeline, though, in the 1960s, he and others managed to get together as a team, collaborate to engineer that new material, now 10 years old, into a device. But it still wasn't widely deployed. Then we see the 1970s or so, it was introduced into cars, it was deployed in small amounts. But the game changer here was the 1975 introduction of legislation. That changed everything. But how did we get to 1975? Oh, and by the way, it should be clear that this material had been discovered 25 years earlier. It could have been doing all that good work all that time. But part of the problem is that the world wasn't ready for it yet. Today, we all have Eugene Haudry's materials. We carry it around with us. It's in the catalytic converters of our cars. And we don't think anything of it. But it turns out those catalytic converters were highly controversial when they were first launched, in something that might sound familiar today when we talk about CO2. So it turns out, and I know in the interest of time, I'll just be brief about this, but in the New York Times, there were, of course, editorials written about this, and I'll show in the highlights in yellow, the dumbest thing that ever happened to the automobile, from the vice president of Chrysler. Things that were pointed to, also in the New York Times, it would add cost. They couldn't see how this approach would work. It's complicated. It will hardly ever work. Cars will be useless in a year. And yet today, we all have one of these catalytic converters. And by the way, this is Popular Mechanics in 1951 that introduced this idea. And yet it took till 1975 and the devastating effects that we were seeing before we did something about it. In addition, if you weren't compelled by that and the cessation of acid rain, we can show a little bit of data. Here is one of the pollutants that causes smog and another component also that contributes to acid rain. Along this axis is how concentrated it is, and here is a year-by-year plot. 1975 is roughly here, so it takes a little bit of time for those atmospheric levels to decrease, but over time you see this precipitous drop in both of these pollutants. This is directly related to catalytic converters, as well as to some other emissions technologies. So again, we have this ability to do this, as long as there is a will. So now these catalytic converters and similar technologies are something we can approach for CO2. Let me take a moment to segue to a slightly different sideline. By the way, on that whole topic of catalytic converters, it's removing nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, those contributors to smog and acid rain. One of the reasons it wouldn't work is because of leaded gasoline. So one of the reasons that we no longer see leaded gasoline and the lead that introduced to our environment is the adoption of this technology. So we got a 2-for-1 deal, or 3-for-1 deal. No SOx, no NOx, and no more lead getting emitted. So lots of wins from this one invention. So on to CO2. Well, here's the message of hope. I and other scientists are working by the thousands on this topic, and these materials exist today. But like the GM kinds of pushback, the Chrysler pushback, it's too expensive, it's too difficult, it won't work, are usually what we hear in different hallways. So again, back to this as the motivating plot. We really want to be down here, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, around 350 parts per million. So that means both removing CO2 from the atmosphere, as well as trying to back off on the amount that's coming out of tailpipes, factory chimneys, and those kinds of technologies. So maybe I can motivate you to say that we chemists make materials all the time. And so in the amount that's held in something as small as this thimble, and I've used this analogy in some other talks before, it can contain a bit of powder. And what we want are places where that CO2 can be absorbed and stuck and then maybe squeezed out later, possibly for another kind of chemical use. But in the space of one thimbleful, it turns out that it has the surface area of 3 football fields. Imagine how many CO2, carbon dioxide gas molecules, could stick to a football field. It's enormous, but 3 of those are in the space of this one container. So little amounts of materials that we chemists and engineers can synthesize can do great things. And so these types of materials are shown like this. I'm not going to do much chemistry here today, but I'll just say that these are highly engineered, highly tailorable materials that make use of deep knowledge, deep benches of knowledge, if you will, in the chemical sector, in some of our other kinds of materials sectors, to make these almost sponge-like structures. And it turns out CO2 can stick to some of those pores and cavities that we see. Some of these materials, related ones, not exactly for CO2, are things that you have in your home today. It turns out that activated carbon, something that is in water filters in your home, is also a high surface area material, and these can be tailored to do some types of the chemistry I'm talking about. In addition, another material that we commonly make are called zeolites. By the way, zeolites are in your laundry detergent right now. There's some of what removes some of the oils and things as we wash our clothes, but we're able to make these in the hundreds of kilograms, the ton scale. And then finally, the one that I was just showing you is rather expensive as a material today, but it's a metal organic framework. And you see these surface areas range, over, let's say, 2,500 square meters per gram up to greater than 6,000 square meters per gram. That's what makes the football field type of thing, the analogy, work. So these types of materials have this microstructure that we chemists can tailor. And all 3 of these, even the zeolites, are being envisioned for CO2 types of applications. We're just not using them today because it's perceived as being too expensive to do so. But what cost is a clean environment? What cost is that future for our children, as Brian so eloquently put? Well, a little bit about these materials, just so you take something away, and again, a minimum of chemistry. What those have are tailorable metal centers, and there's a whole periodic table of metals that one can choose from. They have these things called organic linkers. An organic chemical is like an oil, gasoline, the parts that make up plastic. We have an enormous catalog of these, tens of thousands of such linkers. So a whole periodic table of metals, a whole tens of thousands of linkers in a catalog. Imagine all the combinations. And these are sort of like tinker toys. And then from these tinker toys, we build these materials tailored to specific applications. And this is, again, another chemical structure of what it looks like. And just to give you an idea, these are how the CO2 binds. They have little sticky sites for the CO2 molecules. That's about as much chemistry as I've got, by the way. So this is part of an overall portfolio. I'm not here to suggest that this is all we do. Actually, when you think about it, this has to be part of a whole set of actions. Of course, on one side is to reduce those things that produce carbon, produce CO2 in the atmosphere. That includes, for example, a plant-based diet. Thank you for mentioning that, Brian, just as an example. And also using high-efficiency appliances, switching away from gasoline-powered things. But of course, we still live a life in modern society that still generates CO2. So if you do generate CO2, as one will, then we should find other ways to enhance a removal of carbon, and there are many ways. The trees outside do that for us, as many of you know. The thing that I'm talking about is called direct air capture or carbon mineralization. Those are related to some of the topics that I'm mentioning here. But it's part of an overall suite of many, many different technologies. We aren't saying that this is the only one. I'll say that the National Academy of Sciences estimates that we need to remove 10 gigatons, an impossibly large number for us to comprehend as humans. A gigaton is basically 1 billion metric tons, and this CO2 is around us. We're generating it each year. But remember, back to that Eugene Hodry kind of material with catalytic converters on every car. Somehow we've managed to do that sort of thing. So there is hope. So the key message is that we have to deploy these materials to stop this warming that we're trying to prevent. And you have to assume that to some extent we will use fossil fuels in some capacity. So whenever we use it, is it possible to have one of these air capture or other kinds of CO2 removal technologies? And again, this is my absolute last chemistry slide. CO2 drawn here. What we rely on are some sticky molecules. Sometimes people say, I don't really understand how these might work, but they have some nitrogen-pendant molecules, and those nitrogens turn out to be great for making an otherwise unreactive molecule stick somewhere. So as I said, it's part of an overall portfolio. Some are very low cost, but also low capacity. We think of some of the solutions that go, for example, into the ocean and the like. These are still part of the overall portfolio because they are low cost to pursue. But because that capacity can be low, we don't think of it as just the only answer. Direct air capture and carbon mineralization are, and I put that in quotes, unlimited in capacity. It just means that we can make materials to uptake a lot of the CO2, but they are costly, more than $100 per ton, and that's a metric ton. And then there are some other alternatives in low-cost land-based things like forestation and the like. So you see this is part of a composite picture where we come together with many technologies, with this one being relatively new and, let's say, human-driven. I will say that ours is not the only type of material. I work for a number of different teams trying to look at the feasibility of these. This is one more plot that says the capacity for CO2 capture versus its operating temperature. And I only show this to show that there are many, many different kinds. I mentioned zeolites before, for example. But there's a whole suite of materials that chemists and engineers are pursuing worldwide, in the US, in Asia, and in universities in Europe especially. Finally, and I'm near a close, I'll say a couple of comments. So a huge barrier to the success here, and I've been working in this since about 2008 or so, a huge barrier to success is that some early scientific reports by very respected groups, the American Physical Society is one. There was a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and another related work estimated that the removal of CO2 would cost on the order of $10,000 per ton of CO2. Imagine a publication coming out hoping to interest investors and venture capital in trying these new materials out. These reports and these early studies had very depressive effects. It looked like it was a hopeless, tilting at windmills kind of exercise. Today, I can say that we are under $300 a ton in terms of some of the technologies, and we can maybe talk more about what that means at scale. But it's just to say that sometimes these reports that are well-meaning and meant to study some of these important aspects, the economic aspects of the scientific enterprise that I and others are engaged in as researchers. Sometimes they don't quite get it right. And we saw that in the catalytic converter example also. Finally, on economic viability, there's a 2018 report that feels a little more modern than the ones I just quoted from the national academies. And they are projecting costs could fall below $100 a ton. That's a point where we can deploy it at large scale. Okay, let me segue to then the last bit. So to give you a little more hope, this is being deployed. So the materials I talked about are in demonstration sites in several places in the world right now. This is outside of Zurich, Switzerland. This is a group called Climeworks. And one of these units that's shown, these guys are standing next to one of the fans, just to give you an idea of size scale. What's inside that unit that looks like a washing machine is kilograms and kilograms of powders like the ones that I've described. So they are already doing this direct air capture, removing CO2 from the atmosphere in Zurich, Switzerland. In addition, there's another local meaning United States, there's a US-based company, Global Thermostat, that has its headquarters now in Colorado, and they have a demonstration plant out in California in Menlo Park. Slightly different technology and a different design, but they have this modular design that can collect 2 million tons per year. So imagine, we're trying to get to gigatons, but 2 million tons is an extraordinary number. By the way, just for reference, one tree living for 40 years, it will remove, they estimate, on the order of, I believe, 1 ton for one tree. So 2 million is a great number. And I'll say that, once again, you have CO2, you've sucked it up by these direct air capture units. What do you do with it? Well, the Climeworks gentlemen that I showed in that slide actually heat that material up, which causes the CO2 to be squeezed out, and they send it off to a drink plant for carbonating soda, similar to Coca-Cola. Another group here in the United States uses CO2 that's been captured out of an environmental situation, out of a flue stack, actually, and they convert it into artificial coral to replenish coral reefs. So when you have this CO2, sometimes you can do something with it that's useful as a product. So let me end on this note. So we researchers, we do envision a better world. My daughter, her friends, they want me to bring this message so you know we're working on this, and we've seen an example with catalytic converters where we were successful. What can you do? That's, of course, why we're here. So just know, first of all, share the information. Share with your children and grandchildren. Share with your neighbors that there's hope. There are thousands and thousands of scientists and engineers working on this. We are all doing that because we envision that better world one day. And also, please, support the research enterprise, not by donations is what I'm saying, but by contacting your members of Congress to support this kind of research and to push it forward, to allow that this is possible, these are possible solutions to this global problem. And I will just say one last thing. So my daughter is able to come and take one of these types of materials. Oh, forgive me, I was about to close, but I just wanted to say one other thing before I stop. I do also want to highlight that my part in this is getting the word out. I've been fortunate enough, and this group learned of my work through a TED Talk. So TED Talks and other public presentations are something we scientists do to get the word out to others. So I wanted to give a shout out to the TED organization in town who has given me the opportunity and a platform to spread the word. But I will say that, again, to close, we're here because I'm hopeful, my daughter is hopeful for a future, and I hope all of you are left with a bit of hope. So my daughter, she holds up that thimble. She'll tell you about the material that's inside and how much CO2 it can capture. And we're going to go forward from here with that as our message. Thank you all, and I hope I can take questions. And I am so sorry, it's so bright up here, I can't see anybody's faces. So I can't tell if it's landing well. Anyway, but may I take questions from those who would like to ask anything? Oh, afterwards. Oh, forgive me. Well, I will let Melody, I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure, of course.
And let's have another round of applause. You have left us all so inspired. And I know I'm not speaking for only myself, but I have never met a chemist or a scientist devoted to research and helping to better the environment. So thank you so much. And if there was ever a time where we need to have optimistic measures that let us have hope for our poor planet, this is it. And there she is. So thank you. Members of the Welcome Team will now take up a collection to help support the Society. If you are moved to make a donation today, we appreciate anything you may be able to give. We rely on the generosity of our members and friends to ensure that our community can keep providing our many free programs. You can also donate through the QR code above on the screen. Or if you are interested in becoming a member of the Ethical Society, our membership coordinator, Courtney Scott Camarata, will be available afterwards to answer your questions. There is a great deal going on here and many ways to get involved and connected to the Ethical Society community. If you want more details on any of these events, you can check out our weekly email newsletter. You can check out the Friends of the Ethical Society Facebook group, or just email the relevant staff member. And all staff and board information is on our website. Now is the time for announcements, and I only have two, but they are very important. I'll call first on Stephanie Segala for the first one.
I want you all to promise that you are going to come